Good evening, folks. This is the weird part. I am your host, Vincent Treewell, and now we're going to do part 2 of the Necedah Marian apparitions, and it's going to be kind of wide-ranging because we stopped at 1955, and in 1955, shall we say, things were much more organized. You had Marian van Hoof receiving messages from the Blessed Virgin Mary. You had Henry Swan, who was the head of the local Chamber of Commerce and the owner of the Ford dealership, and a big influence on her, but also apparently a deep believer in the messages she was bringing. And you had the Catholic hierarchy who declared that her messages were not real and should not be listened to. So that all had reached a head by 1955, and that's where we stopped. But don't worry, the story did not stop at all. The story only gets weirder from there. So now, folks, if you'll just bear with me for a moment, I want to bring a few historical notes in kind of a chronological order so we can all be on the same page. So in 1955, Bishop Treacley has officially condemned the apparitions at Necedah. Also in that year, Henry Swan has compiled accounts of Marian van Hoof's visions and experiences with apparitions and her experiencing the stigmata. Okay, so he's begun writing all this stuff down. In 1959, he edited published 4 volumes of material entitled My Work with Necedah, and it is a voluminous work that covers all of her messages, and in my humble opinion, he had a huge influence over her, and though she had some controversial opinions of her own, but he had a lot of influence over her, and he publishes this in 1959. In 1960, Godfried van Hoof, Marian's husband, dies as an older man of leukemia. Again, natural causes, nothing weird there, just mentioning that happened.
I just want to make one brief correction. Where I said that Henry Swan published a 4-volume books on his work and Marian van Hoof's revelations and visitations and experiences at Necedah, the first volume was published in 1959, not all 4. The first volume's over 600 pages, but there would be 3 more to come, so just to clear that up.
In 1964, Bishop Treacley died and was replaced by Bishop Frederick W. Frecking. 5 years later, in 1969, Bishop Frecking ordered a commission to reinvestigate the shrine, and in late 1970 or early 1971, that commission found essentially exactly the same thing, that the apparitions and visitations were false, and that they should not be listened to, contained no value, and were generally condemned. In 1975, Bishop Frecking placed Marian van Hoof and 6 of her followers under an interdict, which is a powerful step for a devout Catholic because it denies them the sacraments at their church. They may not receive Mass, they may not receive any of the sacraments of the church. Not easily deterred, in 1977, an order of nuns was established, and an orphanage at the shrine under the auspices of Marian van Hoof and her movement, and independent, for all practical purposes, of the Catholic Church. The following year, 1978, Marian van Hoof remarried a man named Ray Hurt. I mention this briefly because it's thrown around in anti-Van Hoof literature as being scandalous because he was somewhat younger than her. I believe he was about 20 years younger than her. Again, the relevance escapes me, but some people like to make a very large deal about that. Her previous husband had died 18 years earlier. I don't see the scandal there, but some people do. The next several years would be chaotic for the shrine at Necedah. In May of 1979, it was announced that the shrine had been consecrated by Archbishop Edward Stellick of the North American Old Catholic Church, a Catholic, in quotation marks, schismatic organization that is certainly Catholic in the minds of the believers, but is not affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. Less than 2 years later, in January of 1981, Stellick would leave the North American Old Catholic Church and his position there as an archbishop and return to the Roman Catholic Church as a layperson and denounce the Necedah apparitions as a hoax. Stellick was replaced rather quickly by Francis de Benedetto, a bishop in the Old Catholic Church, which is a separate organization from the North American Old Catholic Church. The following year, in 1982, the shrine would start a school, which exists to this day. In 1983, de Benedetto, much in the footsteps of Stellick, left the Old Catholic Church, returned to the Roman Catholic Church, and denounced the Necedah apparitions as a hoax. The following year, 1984, Marian van Hoof died of natural causes at the age of 74. Now, one might think that the changes in leadership and the death of the founder would have ended the shrine movement, but that is not the case, and the shrine continues to this day, with several bizarre incidents punctuating its existence over the past couple of decades. Before I get into those incidents, I'd like to discuss briefly the messages delivered by Marian van Hoof and how they changed over time. There was, in researching this, a fair amount of difficulty in finding out exactly when she said various things that she had said. This is not like getting court transcripts. The person speaking the message, Van Hoof, is not the same person recording it, which is usually Henry Swan, and there's no contemporaneous dating of when this was said that's verifiable by any outside source. So I'm left with less than complete verifiable, she said this on this date. But I have read quite a bit of her messages, and they do seem to change significantly over time. In the very beginning, and this is my description, feel free to look them up and make your own conclusions, but the way I would describe it is this. In the beginning, she starts out very, what you might call, old-fashioned mainstream. Their calls for greater piety, better morality, condemnation of sin. There's a political tint to them, but the biggest concern politically is anti-communism. And there's a generally vibe of a middle-aged, devoutly religious person condemning what they see as sinful practices in society and telling people to be more devout, to pray more, and to lead more holy personal lives. That, and then there's some concern about the Soviets, the communist threat, which was not at all uncommon in the 1940, 1950s world within and definitely without the Catholic Church. Anti-communism was huge at that point in time, and the idea that a rural working class Catholic lady would be concerned about Soviet infiltration is not at all surprising. Over time, the messages get stranger and stranger. They do continue to emphasize personal piety. They do continue to call for saying the rosary daily and things like that. They, however, take on a real, increasingly anti-Semitic edge, and that's still in the 50s. And things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is just straight up hate speech, do get referenced in what are her messages. And they're hard to read, hard to listen to. They're very bigoted. As time passes, she starts to see visions that are more than just the Virgin Mary, she begins to see demons, she begins to see celestial beings, which are like angels, but maybe they're aliens, but a lot of that's not really clear. As time goes on, she begins to say some things that are really quite unique, that people who live around the shrine will be saved from a coming judgment of God, a chastisement, and if you live right by the shrine, you'll be protected. That a UFO, that a flying saucer, a spacecraft, will come and take the faithful away. And at some point she's saying that the spacecraft will come and that it will be piloted by an alien and will take the faithful to Middle Earth. So make of that what you will. She also begins to see other figures that are not demons nor angels nor the Virgin Mary, but include President George Washington and President Abraham Lincoln, statues of whom are at the shrine to this day. So the nature of Marian van Hoof's experiences and revelations and encounters changes and branches out over time into what some people would say was of questionable sanity. Others would say that she was receiving different messages. And if you look at it from a perspective of, say, Jacques Vallée or John Keel, it's not uncommon that a visionary will start out with a fairly orthodox, small or orthodox message and then be led in stranger and stranger directions. And that's definitely what seems to have happened here. There is also, and this was true for a period of decades, a very strong apocalyptic tone to Marian van Hoof's messages. That there was a real prediction, or repeated prediction, that nuclear war would occur, that World War III would occur, that the destruction of the earth was expected momentarily. And followers were encouraged to engage in what today we might call prepper or survivalist practices, which I'm not necessarily condemning. It's a good idea to have some food and water and things put aside. But there was a real end of days tone to what she was saying, despite the fact that it went on for many years. And sometimes the World War III is right around the corner message brings out the worst in some people. An example of this happened in early February of 1980, when a man who in that era was described as shell shock, what we would call today PTSD, a veteran of World War II, named Harry Binkowski, got into a fatal altercation with a friend of his named Tommy Huber and ended up killing Huber. This led to the police being called, and a 6-hour shootout ensued, during which Binkowski was also himself killed. Apparently, Binkowski had set up his house like you might consider an arsenal, that he was definitely prepared for an end times physical battle, and the events that led to him killing his friend will never be known. And he died in a shootout with the police. And this, just seems indicative of the end of days. The Russians are coming, the Chinese are coming, the U.S. government's coming, everybody's coming to kill us, sort of ideology that had become more and more prevalent in Van Hoof's messages. Obviously, she's not to blame for actions that Binkowski took, but such a message does tend to draw people who are already unstable and might be more prone to violence than a more mentally healthy person. It is worth pointing out that to this day, each year masses are said at the shrine for both Binkowski and Huber. They are kept alive in the memories of those who still worship at the shrine. Every year they have ceremonial masses for them. And I get that from their own newsletter, so that's where I get that from. In 1998, a man named Jeffrey L. Maas, M-A-A-S, was caught for the theft of multiple religious statues out of churches and found with a hoard of these often quite valuable works of art that he had secreted away in a shed because it was his belief that a comet was coming to wipe out the earth before Y2K, and that the U.S. government was going to destroy all the Catholic churches and all Catholic statuary, and he had to hide these valuable icons for their own protection. there was apparently no other criminal motive, and Mr. Maas ended up receiving probation. I mention this in large part because he was also a follower of the shrine, and there is just a continuing line of people who are drawn into strange activities, or conversely show up at the shrine because they already are having these feelings. The shrine is a magnet for this sort of strange fanaticism. In May of 2008, Juneau County Sheriff's deputies responded to a call for a wellness check in a home in Necedah. Upon arriving, they found the decaying corpse of Magdalene Middlesworth in the bathroom of the house. Middlesworth, 90, had died 2 months previously of natural causes, but a very small fringe religious group affiliated with the shrine, but not accepted by the shrine, had kept her body unpreserved in the home in the belief that she was going to be resurrected from the dead, and had meanwhile continued to receive and spend her Social Security checks. This ultimately led to the conviction of a clergyman named Alan Bushy, formerly of a group called the Orthodox Catholic Church of Russia in the Americas, and more recently the leader of the Order of the Divine Will, to receiving a sentence of 2 years in prison for hiding a corpse. He pled guilty and acknowledged that, in his words, he should have left the supernatural to God and called the coroner. At this point, I'd like to discuss briefly the work of Kenneth van Hoof, Marian's son, one of her sons, who runs a website called Diamond Star Light Beacon. And apparently, while I was researching this, so in the last few weeks, there's been some sort of falling out, and Kenneth van Hoof apparently is no longer in good graces with the leadership of the shrine itself. He still has a listed address in Necedah and still has a very active website. I was reading his Diamond Star Light Beacon reports in the monthly newsletter archive of the shrine itself, but they now no longer are in the newsletter, and they've been retroactively removed. The best I can say about Diamond Star Light Beacon is it definitely adds on even more crazy. You've got the anti-Semitism and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but there's also just I won't say every, but practically every conspiracy you can think of. The less sense it makes, the more likely it is to be there. And yeah, it's very apocalyptic. It's also warning you, on the one hand, the end of the world is coming. On the other hand, don't eat food with GMOs in it. So, yeah, it's really just a basket of crazy. This guy is not only anti-vax, he's anti-medicine, period. And I'll just let that speak for itself. yes, he is Marian van Hoof's son, Kenneth, and he runs Diamond Starlight Beacon, and he is now apparently estranged from the leadership of the shrine itself, which continues to exist and run a school and is well on its way to building a large enclosed house of prayer. So that's still going on. Right about now, I'd like to just conclude with some final thoughts on what did or did not happen in Necedah in 1949, 1950, and for the decades thereafter. Was this all a hoax, a money grab? That really seems hard for me to believe, especially that nobody really made a lot of money. Henry Swan ultimately lost the Ford dealership and ended up living in a trailer on the grounds of the shrine. I don't see the payoff that anybody received throughout this whole endeavor. A lot more has been donated than has ever been reaped. So take that for what it's worth. Was Marian van Hoof simply a mentally ill person who should have been perhaps hospitalized or treated in some way for her condition? That, I feel, is a very loaded question. Do 100,000 pilgrims show up to listen to the ramblings of just some person that is unwell? I don't think so. I think there's something more to what she was bringing, whether there's any paranormal component whatsoever. At a minimum, she was a rare person who brings a message that people are listening to, right or wrong, for better or worse. That's not an endorsement, but a person who brings a message that people are ready to hear at that moment in time. And I don't think that that's just something that's a symptom of mental illness. I think there's more, though it may coexist with mental illness. It requires having an understanding of the time and place you're in and really speaking to that. And she certainly did that. And I think a lot of figures throughout history have done that. Also, and hey, this is a paranormal podcast. We talk about paranormal stuff. Were there entities that were trying, entities that were trying to spread their message openly or in a hidden manner through Marian van Hoof? And did that happen? There are numerous people who will, or at least did while they're alive, testify to seeing and experiencing supernatural phenomena. Did that happen? Were there celestial beings? Were there, whatever you want to call them, spirits, interacting with her and with some of her followers? Was this a real, I'm putting real in big quotes, incident, in fact repeated numerous incidents, of some sort of non-human intelligence contacting humans through a channel medium or through a seer, a prophetess? That is not exactly an unheard of event. I mean, that's something that is universal throughout world cultures. Was she a medium for, and I mean medium in the Marshall McLuhan way rather than the seance way. Okay, was she a voice, a spokesperson for non-human intelligences? Having looked at what I've looked at in this, I cannot rule that out. I cannot rule it in and say, oh yeah, that's totally what happened. I don't know that. I doubt anyone walking the earth today knows that. And honestly, frankly, I don't know that she ever knew. That's something that I'll leave the audience to reach their own conclusions. Thank you, and good night.